When was the Red Cross founded?
The Red Cross was founded in Switzerland in October 1863 when the delegates from 16 nations met in Geneva to discuss establishing in all civilized countries permanent societies of volunteers who in time of war would give help to the wounded without regard for nationality. The idea had been described in a pamphlet published in 1862 by Swiss philanthropist Jean-Henri Dunant, 1828–1910. In 1859 Dunant was in Italy when French and Italian troops under Napoleon III fought Austrians under Emperor Francis Joseph in an indecisive battle in Lombardy, northern Italy. At Solferino, Dunant observed the suffering of the wounded and immediately organized a group of volunteers to help them. At the Geneva Conference in 1863, the delegates decided the organization symbol and name. The name of the organization comes from its flag showing a red cross on a white background, the inverse of the flag of Switzerland, where the organization was founded. The following August, 1864, European delegates met again. This time they were joined by 2 American observers. The meeting gave rise to the First Geneva Convention, which determined the protection of sick and wounded soldiers and of medical personnel and facilities during wartime. The Red Cross was adopted as a symbol for neutral aid. In Muslim countries the organization is known as the Red Crescent.
When was the Red Cross founded?
The Red Cross was founded in Switzerland in October 1863 when the delegates from 16 nations met in Geneva to discuss establishing in all civilized countries permanent societies of volunteers who in time of war would give help to the wounded without regard for nationality. The idea had been described in a pamphlet published in 1862 by Swiss philanthropist Jean-Henri Dunant, 1828–1910. In 1859 Dunant was in Italy when French and Italian troops under Napoleon III fought Austrians under Emperor Francis Joseph in an indecisive battle in Lombardy, northern Italy. At Solferino, Dunant observed the suffering of the wounded and immediately organized a group of volunteers to help them. At the Geneva Conference in 1863, the delegates decided the organization symbol and name. The name of the organization comes from its flag showing a red cross on a white background, the inverse of the flag of Switzerland, where the organization was founded. The following August, 1864, European delegates met again. This time they were joined by 2 American observers. The meeting gave rise to the First Geneva Convention, which determined the protection of sick and wounded soldiers and of medical personnel and facilities during wartime. The Red Cross was adopted as a symbol for neutral aid. In Muslim countries the organization is known as the Red Crescent.
Who was Clara Barton?
The American humanitarian was called the Angel of the Battlefield for her work during the Civil War, 1861–65. Clara, Clarissa Harlow, Barton. 1821–1912, was a nurse in army camps and on battlefields, where she cared for the wounded. When the fighting ended, Barton formed a bureau to search for missing men. This demanding work left her exhausted. Recuperating in Switzerland in 1869, Barton learned of the newly formed International Red Cross, established 1863. She rallied to the aid of that volunteer organization, tending the needs of those wounded in the fighting of the Franco-Prussian War, 1870–71, which German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, 1815–1898, had provoked in his attempt to create a unified German Empire. In 1877 Barton began working to form the American Red Cross. Her efforts came to fruition in 1881 with the establishment of the first U.S. branch of the International Red Cross. She became the organization's first president, a post she held from 1882 to 1904. When Johnstown, Pennsylvania, experienced a devastating flood in 1889, Barton took charge of relief work there. She subsequently advocated a clause be added to the Red Cross Constitution, stating that the organization would also provide relief during calamities other than war. She was successful. It is because of Barton that the Red Cross has become a familiar and welcome sight in times of disaster.
Who was Clara Barton?
The American humanitarian was called the Angel of the Battlefield for her work during the Civil War, 1861–65. Clara, Clarissa Harlow, Barton. 1821–1912, was a nurse in army camps and on battlefields, where she cared for the wounded. When the fighting ended, Barton formed a bureau to search for missing men. This demanding work left her exhausted. Recuperating in Switzerland in 1869, Barton learned of the newly formed International Red Cross, established 1863. She rallied to the aid of that volunteer organization, tending the needs of those wounded in the fighting of the Franco-Prussian War, 1870–71, which German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, 1815–1898, had provoked in his attempt to create a unified German Empire. In 1877 Barton began working to form the American Red Cross. Her efforts came to fruition in 1881 with the establishment of the first U.S. branch of the International Red Cross. She became the organization's first president, a post she held from 1882 to 1904. When Johnstown, Pennsylvania, experienced a devastating flood in 1889. Barton took charge of relief work there. She subsequently advocated a clause be added to the Red Cross Constitution, stating that the organization would also provide relief during calamities other than war. She was successful. It is because of Barton that the Red Cross has become a familiar and welcome sight in times of disaster.
When was insulin discovered?
Insulin, a hormone that regulates sugar levels in the body, was first discovered in 1889 by German physiologist Oskar Minkowski, 1858–1931, and German physician Joseph von Mering, 1849–1908. They observed that the removal of the pancreas caused diabetes in dogs. Researchers set about isolating the substance, but it was not until 1922 that insulin was used to treat diabetic patients. The first genetically engineered human insulin was produced by American scientists in 1978.
When was insulin discovered?
Insulin, a hormone that regulates sugar levels in the body, was first discovered in 1889 by German physiologist Oskar Minkowski, 1858–1931, and German physician Joseph von Mering, 1849–1908. They observed that the removal of the pancreas caused diabetes in dogs. Researchers set about isolating the substance, but it was not until 1922 that insulin was used to treat diabetic patients. The first genetically engineered human insulin was produced by American scientists in 1978.
When did the U.S. labor movement begin?
It began in the early 1800s, when skilled workers, such as carpenters and blacksmiths, banded together in local organizations with the goal of securing better wages. By the time fighting broke out in the Civil War, 1861–65, the first national unions had been founded again, by skilled workers. However, many of these early labor organizations struggled to gain widespread support and soon fell apart. But by the end of the century, several national unions, including the United Mine Workers, 1890, and the American Railway Union, 1893, emerged. In the last 2 decades of the 1800s, violence accompanied labor protests and strikes while opposition to the unions mounted. Companies shared blacklists of the names of workers suspected of union activities, hired armed guards to forcibly break strikes, and retained lawyers to successfully invoke the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. To crush strikes, lawyers argued that strikes interfered with interstate commerce, which was declared illegal by the Sherman legislation, which had not been the intent of the lawmakers. In the early decades of the 1900s, unions made advances. But many Americans continued to view organizers and members as radicals. The climate changed for the unions during the Great Depression, 1929–39. With so many Americans out of work, many blamed business leaders for the economy's failure and began to view the unions in a new light as organizations to protect the interests of workers. In 1935, the federal government strengthened the union's cause in passing the National Labor Relations Act, also called the Wagner Act, protecting the rights to organize and to bargain collectively. When worker representatives, usually labor union representatives, negotiate with employers. The legislation also set up the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, which still works today to penalize companies that engage in unfair labor practices. The constitutionality of the act was challenged in court in 1937. But the Supreme Court upheld the legislation. The unions grew increasingly powerful over the next decade. By 1945, more than one-third of all non-agricultural workers belonged to a union. Having made important gains during World War II, 1939–45, including hospital insurance coverage, paid vacations and holidays, and pensions, union leaders continued to urge workers to strike to gain more ground, something leaders felt was the workers' right amidst the unprecedented prosperity of the post-war era. But strikes soon impacted the life of the average American. Consumers faulted the unions for shortages of consumer goods, suspension of services, and inflated prices. Congress responded by passing the Labor Management Relations Act, or the Taft-Hartley Act, in 1947, which limits the impact of unions by prohibiting certain kinds of strikes, setting rules for how unions could organize workers, and establishing guidelines for how strikes that may impact the nation's health or safety are to be handled.
How old is the AFL-CIO?
The roots of the American Federation of Labor Congress of Industrial Organizations. AFL-CIO, today a federation of national unions. Date to 1881, when the Federation of Organized Trade and Labor Unions was formed in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, by trade union leaders representing some 50,000 members in the United States and Canada. Reorganizing in 1886, the Association of Unions changed its name to the American Federation of Labor, AFL, and elected Samuel Gompers, 1850–1924, president. Unlike the open membership policy of the Knights of Labor, from whom the AFL gained numerous members in 1886, the AFL determined to organize by craft. At the outset, its member unions included a total of 140,000 skilled laborers. Gompers, who immigrated from England in 1863 and became the first registered member of the Cigar Makers International Union in 1864, had been active in labor for more than 2 decades. Once chosen as president of the AFL, Gompers remained in that office, with the exception of only 1 year. Until his death in 1924. During the nearly 40-year period, he shaped the Labour Federation and helped it make strides by determining a general policy that allowed member unions autonomy. Unlike the Knights of Labour, which pursued long-term goals such as Knights leader Terence Powderly's abstract objective of making every man his own master, every man his own employer, the AFL focused its efforts on specific, short-term goals such as higher wages, shorter hours, and the right to bargain collectively, when an employer agrees to negotiate with workers/union representatives. In the 1890s, the AFL was weakened by labor violence, which evoked public fears. A July 1892 strike at the Carnegie Steel plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania, turned into a riot between angry steel workers and Pinkerton guards. The militia was called in to monitor the strike, which 5 months later ended in failure for the AFL-affiliated steel workers. Nevertheless, under Gompers's leadership, membership of the AFL grew to more than 1 million by 1901 and to 2.5 million by 1917, when it included 111 national unions and 27,000 local unions. The Federation collected dues from its members, creating a fund to aid striking workers. The organization avoided party politics, instead seeking out and supporting advocates regardless of political affiliation. The AFL worked to support the establishment of the U.S. Department of Labor, 1913, which administers and enforces statutes promoting the welfare and advancement of the American workforce, and the passage of the Clayton Antitrust Act, 1914, which strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, eventually delivering a blow to monopolies. The CIO was founded in 1938. In the early 1930s, several AFL unions banded together as the Committee for Industrial Organization and successfully conducted campaigns to sign up new members in mass production facilities such as the automobile, steel, and rubber industries. Since these initiatives, which resulted in millions of new members, were against the AFL policy of signing up only skilled laborers by craft, the CIO had reached out to all industrial workers, regardless of skill level or craft. A schism resulted within the AFL. The unions that had participated in the CIO membership drive were expelled from the AFL. The CIO established itself as a federation in 1938, officially changing its name to the Congress of Industrial Organizations. In 1955, amidst a climate of increasing anti-unionism, the AFL and CIO rejoined to form one strong voice. Today the organization has craft and industrial affiliates at the international, national, state, and local levels, with membership totaling in the millions.
What was Love Canal?
When Love Canal, a community east of Niagara Falls, New York, made international headlines in August 1978, it was only after the neighborhood had already been the Subject of local newspaper stories since 1976. And sadly, more headlines followed. Into 1980. What had become clear during these years was that Love Canal was toxic. Community residents had experienced unusually high incidences of cancer, miscarriages, birth defects, and other illnesses. There were also reports that foul odors, oozing sludge, and multicolored pools of substances were emerging from the ground. And children and animals returned from outdoor play with rashes and burns on their skin. Unbeknownst to the residents, all of these problems were attributable to the history of the site upon which their community had been built. Beginning in 1947, the Hooker Electrochemical Company had used Love Canal, with its clay walls, to dump 21,800 tons of chemical waste. In 1953, the company sold the canal to the Niagara School Board for the sum of $1. The deed acknowledged the buried chemicals, although it did not disclose their type or toxicity. A disclaimer protected the firm from future liability. The canal pit was subsequently sealed with a clay cap designed to prevent rainwater from disturbing the chemicals. Grass was planted. Soon Love Canal had become a 15-acre field. The following year, a school was under construction on the site. In 1955, 400 elementary school children began attending classes there and playing on the surrounding fields. Development happened fast. Roads, sewers, and utility lines crisscrossed the site, disrupting the soil. While residents began to discern problems as early as 1958, when they complained of nauseating smells and incidences of skin problems. It was not until the mid-1970s that the extent of the hazard became evident. It was then that unusually heavy rainfalls caused chemicals to surface. A portion of the schoolyard collapsed. Strange substances seeped into basements, and trees and gardens died. In October 1976, the Niagara Gazette began investigating these problems. But an official investigation did not begin until the following April. By this time, the site was a disaster. Toxins were found in storm sewers and basements. Exposed chemical drums leaked substances, and air tests detected dangerously high chemical levels in homes. Further testing identified more than 200 different compounds at the site, including 12 carcinogens, cancer-causing agents, and 14 compounds that can affect the brain and central nervous system. The residents of Love Canal organized, forming citizen groups including the Love Canal Homeowners Association. These groups succeeded in getting media coverage and in pressuring public officials to act. Finally, on August 2, 1978, the New York State Health Commissioner declared Love Canal unsafe. 6 days later, President Jimmy Carter, 1924, approved emergency assistance, and New York Governor Hugh Carey announced that funds would be used to purchase homes nearest the canal. While more than 200 families that were perceived to be in danger were moved. In 1980, problems resurfaced when researchers found that blood tests of residents showed abnormally high chromosome damage. The state recommended that pregnant women and infants be removed from homes even those that had been certified as safe. In May 1980, conflict ensued between 300 Love Canal homeowners and officials from the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. On May 21, President Carter declared a second emergency at Love Canal. This time the actions were more comprehensive. Almost 800 families were evacuated, and their homes were either destroyed or declared unsafe until further cleanup could be done. 4 years later, a new clay cap was installed over the canal. It was also in 1984 that Occidental Petroleum, parent company of the firm that had dumped chemicals in Love Canal, reached a $20 million settlement with residents.
Why was the fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory important to the labor movement?
The March 25, 1911, blaze, which killed 146 people, most of them women, prompted public outrage and led to the immediate passage of fire safety legislation and became a rallying cry for labor reforms. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory occupied the top 3 floors of a Manhattan office building. It was one of the most successful garment factories in New York City, employing some 1,000 workers, mostly immigrant women. But the conditions were hazardous. The space was cramped, accessible only via stairwells and hallways so narrow that people had to pass single file. Only one of the 4 elevators was regularly in service. The cutting machines in the workroom were gas-powered. Scraps of fabric littered the work areas. The water barrels, for use in case of fire, were not kept full, and the no smoking rule was not strictly enforced. In short, it was an accident waiting to happen. When the fire broke out on a weekend, the cause is unknown since the building was charred so badly. About half of the employees were there. Smoke and fire, however, were not the only causes of death. In the panicked escape, people were trampled, fell in elevator shafts, jumped several stories to the pavement below, and were killed when a fire escape melted and collapsed. While the fire happened during a time of labor reform, those reforms had not come soon enough to save the lives of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory employees, who had been subjected to extremely poor and dangerous working conditions. The disaster became a rallying cry for the labor movement. Tens of thousands of people marched in New York City in tribute to those who had died, calling attention to the grave social problems of the day. In New York State, the fire safety reforms for factories came right away. The legislature appointed investigative commissions to examine factories statewide, and 30 ordinances in New York City were enacted to enforce fire prevention measures. One of the earliest was the Sullivan-Hoye Fire Prevention Law of October 1911, which combined 6 agencies to form an efficient fire commission. Soon factories were required to install sprinkler systems. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire became an object lesson for the entire nation, prompting the consolidation of reform efforts. The much-needed labor reforms, which addressed the miserable working conditions, did not come until years later.
Who was Eugene Debs?
Debs, 1855 to 1926, was a radical labor leader who in 1893 founded the American Railway Union. ARU, an industrial union for all railroad workers. Debs was a charismatic speaker, but he was also a controversial figure in American life around the turn of the century. In 1894, workers at the Pullman Palace Car Company, which manufactured rail cars in Pullman, Illinois, near Chicago, went on strike to protest a significant reduction in their wages. Pullman was a model company town where the railcar manufacturer, founded by American inventor George W. Pullman, 1831 to 1897, in 1867, owned all the land and buildings, and ran the school, bank, and utilities. In 1893, in order to maintain profits following declining revenues, the Pullman Company cut workers' wages by 25 to 40%, but did not adjust rent and prices in the town, forcing many employees and their families into deprivation. In May 1894, a labor committee approached Pullman Company management to resolve the situation. The company, which had always refused to negotiate with employees, responded by firing the labor committee members. The firings incited a strike of all 3,300 Pullman workers. In support of the labor effort, Eugene Debs assumed leadership of the strike. Some Pullman employees had joined the ARU in 1894, and directed all ARU members not to haul any Pullman cars. A general rail strike followed, which paralyzed transportation across the country. In response to what was now being called Debs Rebellion, a July 2, 1894, federal court order demanded all workers to return to the job, but the ARU refused to comply. U.S. President Grover Cleveland, 1837 to 1908, ordered federal troops to break the strike, citing it interfered with mail delivery. The intervention turned violent. Despite public protest, Debs, who was tried for contempt of court and conspiracy, was imprisoned in 1895 for having violated the court order. Debs later proclaimed himself a socialist and became leader of the American left, running unsuccessfully for president as the Socialist Party candidate 5 times. In 1900, 1904, 1908, 1912, and 1920, he actively supported the causes of the international workers of the world. IWW, a radical labor organization founded in 1905.
What happened in the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster?
The U.S. Space Shuttle Columbia was lost upon its re-entry into Earth's Atmosphere on the morning of February 1, 2003. All 7 crew members died. The Columbia was in the skies over Texas about 15 minutes before its scheduled landing at Florida's Kennedy Space Center when, shortly before 9 a.m. EST. Ground controllers lost data from temperature controllers on the spacecraft. Over the next several minutes, National Aeronautics and Space Administration NASA, ground control lost all flight data. At about the same time, witnesses in Texas reported the sound of rolling thunder and debris falling from the sky. Heat detecting weather radar showed a bright red streak moving across the Texas sky. The shuttle was 40 miles above Earth and traveling at 18 times the speed of sound when it disintegrated, leaving a trail of debris from eastern Texas to western Louisiana. The investigation later revealed that damage to the spacecraft had gone unseen during the mission, causing the Columbia to break apart upon re-entry. The shuttle was commanded by Rick Husband and piloted by William McCool. The mission specialists were Michael Anderson, Kalpana Chawla, David Brown, and Laurel Clark. The payload specialist was Israeli astronaut Ilan Ramon. In President George W. Bush's remarks to the nation that day, he said, "These men and women assumed great risk in the service to all humanity." In an age when spaceflight has come to seem almost routine, it is easy to overlook the dangers of travel by rocket. These astronauts knew the dangers, and faced them willingly. The Columbia tragedy occurred within a week of the anniversaries of 2 other deadly NASA disasters. The Challenger explosion on January 28, 1986, and the launch pad fire that killed 3 Apollo astronauts on January 27, 1967. After investigating the cause of the Columbia disaster, NASA focused on implementing a new system of sensors to detect potentially fatal damage to spacecrafts while in orbit. NASA relaunched its Space Shuttle program in late July 2005 with the Discovery.
What happened in the blackout of 2003?
A 3-month investigation found that line failures and system errors combined to cause the power outage that hit much of the Northeast and Great Lakes portions of the United States, as well as parts of eastern Canada. On August 14, 2003, the blackout affected 50 million people, 40 million of them in the United States. A task force headed by the U.S. Department of Energy and its Canadian counterparts delved into the sequence of events that caused the massive power failure. Investigators concluded that mistakes made by First Energy Corporation of Akron, Ohio, had combined with heavy loads of power to stress the interstate electrical grid and cause its failure through a chain reaction. Just after 4 p.m. EDT. On Friday, August 14, power was knocked out from Detroit to Toronto to New York City. The widespread outage immediately affected water supplies, halted air transportation and subway systems, snarled ground transportation, and brought most distribution lines to a standstill, affecting the flow of food and other supplies. Though there were isolated reports of looting, crime was minimal, with New York City reporting a lower crime rate for the night of August 14 than usual. 8 deaths were related to the blackout. Power began to be restored to some areas later that evening, but it was August 16 before all affected areas were back online. 2 weeks later, on August 28, London experienced a blackout at the peak of evening rush hour. The outage paralyzed the British capital and left 500,000 commuters stranded. Power was restored within an hour. A utilities official said that the freak event was caused by 2 faults that happened in quick succession. In late September 2003 there were also widespread power outages in Denmark, Sweden, and Italy. The blackout in Italy affected the entire nation, with the exception of Sardinia, or 57 million people. Because it happened overnight and on a weekend, the impact was minimal. The blackouts drew attention to the need for system upgrades, improved maintenance, and more sophisticated alert systems to prevent such grid failures, which take both an economic and human toll.
When was the Red Cross founded?
The Red Cross was founded in Switzerland in October 1863 when the delegates from 16 nations met in Geneva to discuss establishing in all civilized countries permanent societies of volunteers who in time of war would give help to the wounded without regard for nationality. The idea had been described in a pamphlet published in 1862 by Swiss philanthropist Jean-Henri Dunant, 1828–1910. In 1859 Dunant was in Italy when French and Italian troops under Napoleon III fought Austrians under Emperor Francis Joseph in an indecisive battle in Lombardy, northern Italy. At Solferino, Dunant observed the suffering of the wounded and immediately organized a group of volunteers to help them. At the Geneva Conference in 1863, the delegates decided the organization symbol and name. The name of the organization comes from its flag showing a red cross on a white background, the inverse of the flag of Switzerland, where the organization was founded. The following August, 1864, European delegates met again. This time they were joined by 2 American observers. The meeting gave rise to the First Geneva Convention, which determined the protection of sick and wounded soldiers and of medical personnel and facilities during wartime. The Red Cross was adopted as a symbol for neutral aid. In Muslim countries the organization is known as the Red Crescent.
What was the impact of the accident at 3 Mile Island?
Prior to the March 1979 events at 3 Mile Island, it was thought that the danger of a nuclear meltdown was almost negligible. Though there were safety systems in place, none of them would have prevented a complete catastrophe. Since the accident, the American Nuclear Regulatory Commission, NRC, and utility companies have worked together to resolve the problems that were revealed. Among the efforts and requirements put into place were more stringent licensing procedures for operators, better training of plant operators in the event of an emergency, wider sharing of information on emergency management systems, effort to locate new plants outside of densely populated areas, more rigid quality assurance standards at all plants, strict implementation of the standards, which are subject to review by the NRC, and emergency evacuation plans that must be approved by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. Even with these improvements to safety programs, the accident at Chernobyl in 1986 again produced worldwide concern over the hazards of nuclear power.
What was the Beat movement?
The post-World War II era bred unprecedented prosperity and an uneasy pace in the United States. Out of this environment rose the Beat generation. Alienated youths who rejected society's new materialism and threw off its square attitudes to reinvent cool. The Beat generation of the 1950s bucked convention, embraced iconoclasm, and attracted attention. Mainstream society viewed them as anarchists and degenerates. But many American youths listened to and read the ideas of its leaders, including writers Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, whose novel On the Road, 1957, was the Bible of the Beat movement, William Burroughs, and Lawrence Ferling-Heady, the Beatniks, as they were dubbed by their critics, believed in peace, civil rights, and radical protest as a vehicle for change. They also embraced drugs, mystical, Eastern, religions, and sexual freedom, all controversial ideas during the post-war era. Beat writers and artists found their homes in communities like San Francisco's North Beach, Los Angeles's Venice Beach, and New York City's Greenwich Village. The movement merged, or some would argue, gave birth to the counterculture movements of the 1960s, including the hippies. Beat literature is the movement's legacy.
When were antibiotics invented?
The idea of antibiotics, substances that destroy or inhibit the growth of certain other microorganisms, dates back to the late 19th century. But the first antibiotics were not produced until well into the 20th century. The great French chemist Louis Pasteur, 1822 to 1895, laid the foundation for understanding antibiotics when in the late 1800s he proved that one species of microorganisms can kill another. German bacteriologist Paul Ehrlich, 1854 to 1915, then developed the concept of selective toxicity, in which a specific substance can be toxic, poisonous, to some organisms but harmless to others. Based on this research, scientists began working to develop substances that would destroy disease-spreading microorganisms. A breakthrough came in 1928 when Scottish bacteriologist Alexander Fleming, 1881 to 1955, discovered penicillin. Fleming observed that no bacteria grew around the mold of the genus Penicillium notatum, which had accidentally fallen into a bacterial culture in his laboratory. But penicillin proved difficult to extract. It was not until more than a decade later, in 1941, that the substance was purified and tested by British scientist Howard Florey, 1898 to 1968. Another British scientist, Ernst Boris Chain, 1906 to 1979, developed a method of extracting penicillin. And under his supervision the first large-scale penicillin production facility was completed, making the antibiotic commercially available in 1945. That same year, Fleming, Florey, and Chain shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for their work in discovering and producing the powerful antibiotic, still used today in the successful treatment of bacterial diseases, including pneumonia, strep throat, and gonorrhea. The term antibiotic was coined by American microbiologist Selman A. Waxman, 1888 to 1973, who tested about 10,000 types of soil bacteria for antibiotic capability. In 1943, Waxman discovered a fungus that produced a powerful antibiotic substance, which he called streptomycin. The following year, the antibiotic was in production for use in treating tuberculosis, typhoid fever, bubonic plague, and bacterial meningitis. Although streptomycin was later found to be toxic, it saved countless lives and led to the discovery of many other antibiotics, which have proven both safe and effective.
How long did people believe in the theory of spontaneous generation?
Spontaneous generation, the theory that living things can develop from non-living things, originated in prehistoric times and held sway throughout the Middle Ages, 500–1350. One of the first scientists to test this theory was Italian physician Francesco Redi, 1626–1697. In 1668 Redi demonstrated that as long as meat was covered, maggots would not form on it. When left uncovered, flies would land on the meat, lay eggs, and thus, produce maggots. Despite Redi's findings, the theory of spontaneous generation continued to influence scientists and physicians for centuries. It was ultimately discredited by the successive experiments of Dutch naturalist Antony van Leeuwenhoek. 1632–1723, French chemist and microbiologist Louis Pasteur, 1822–1895. And German physician and pioneer bacteriologist Robert Koch, 1843–1910, who together proved that bacteria cause infectious diseases.
What was the germ theory?
The germ theory, established in the mid-1800s, posited that certain germs cause diseases, refuting the ages-old notion of spontaneous generation. The idea was first put forth by French chemist and microbiologist Louis Pasteur. 1822 to 1895, in a paper he published in 1861. His research, and that of German physician Robert Koch. 1843 to 1910, eventually substantiated the germ theory as fact. They proved that the microbe, or germ, is a living organism that can cause disease. Koch was even able to isolate certain bacteria as the causes of particular diseases, including anthrax, for which he published a method of preventive inoculation. Tuberculosis, cholera, and rinderpest, a cattle disease. The anthrax germ was the first germ linked to a particular disease by Koch in 1876. By the end of the 1800s, researchers had discovered the kinds of bacteria and other microbes responsible for the plague. Diphtheria, dysentery, gonorrhea, leprosy, malaria, pneumonia, tetanus, and other infectious diseases.
What impact did Love Canal have?
The effect of the crisis was felt on many levels, by area residents whose lives were forever changed by the hazards, by residents nearby Love Canal who feared for their own safety, by Americans across the country who lived near other chemical waste sites, and by Americans for whom Love Canal had become synonymous with the problems posed by hazardous waste. At the government level, the tragic events at Love Canal helped to speed the passage of the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980, also known as the Superfund. The legislation set up a multi-billion-dollar fund to clean up the nation's worst toxic disasters. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, assigned cleanup priority to some 1,200 abandoned and potentially contaminated waste sites. Along with the chemical plant explosion at Bhopal, India, in 1984, Love Canal also contributed to a community right to know provision, which was part of the 1985 Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act. The new legislation gave all citizens the right to know what chemicals are produced, stored, or buried in their neighborhoods.
Who were the hippies?
Most hippies of the 1960s and 1970s were young, 15 to 25 years old, white, and from middle-class families. The counterculture, anti-establishment, movement advocated peace, love, and beauty. Having dropped out of modern society, and tuned in to their own feelings. These flower children were as well known for their political and social beliefs as they were for their controversial lifestyle. They opposed American involvement in the Vietnam War, 1954-75, and rejected an industrialized society that seemed to care only about money. They favored personal simplicity, sometimes living in small communes where possessions and work were shared, or living an itinerant lifestyle, in which day-to-day responsibilities were few if any. They wore tattered jeans and bright clothing usually of natural fabrics, grew their hair, braided beads into their locks, walked around barefoot or in sandals, and listened to a new generation of artists including the Beatles, the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Bob Dylan, and Joan Baez. Some hippies were also known for their drug use, experimenting with marijuana and LSD. Some hoped to gain profound insights or even achieve salvation through the drug experience, something hippie guru Timothy Leary told them was possible. New York City's East Village and San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury neighborhood became havens of the counterculture. The movement began on American soil, but was soon embraced elsewhere as well, principally Canada and Great Britain.
When did modern surgery begin?
Modern surgical techniques were developed during the late Renaissance, largely owing to the work of one man. French surgeon Ambroise Paré, 1510–1590, called the father of modern surgery. Prior to Paré's life work, physicians had regarded surgery as something lowly. They left this dirty work to barber surgeons. As a young man living in the French countryside, Paré became apprenticed to one such barber surgeon. When he was only 19 years old, Paré entered Paris's Hôtel Dieu hospital to study surgery. Becoming a master surgeon by 1536, he later served as an army surgeon and then as physician to 4 16th-century French kings Henry II, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. Paré also built a flourishing surgical practice and authored works on anatomy, surgery, the plague, obstetrics, and the treatment of wounds. Opposing the common practice of cauterizing, burning, wounds with boiling oil to prevent infection, he introduced the method of applying a mild ointment and allowing the wound to heal naturally. Paré was renowned for his patient care, which he based on his personal credo, "I dressed him, God cured him."
When was insulin discovered?
Insulin, a hormone that regulates sugar levels in the body, was first discovered in 1889 by German physiologist Oskar Minkowski, 1858–1931, and German physician Joseph von Mering, 1849–1908. They observed that the removal of the pancreas caused diabetes in dogs. Researchers set about isolating the substance, but it was not until 1922 that insulin was used to treat diabetic patients. The first genetically engineered human insulin was produced by American scientists in 1978.
What happened to Challenger?
On January 28, 1986, at Cape Canaveral, Florida, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, launched the 25th mission of its Space Shuttle program. The Challenger carried a crew of 7, including Krista McAuliffe. 1948–1986, who was to be the first schoolteacher in space. She was slated to broadcast a series of lessons to school children throughout America. The crew's commander was Francis Scobie, 1939–1986, who had piloted a 1984 shuttle mission. The pilot was Michael Smith, 1945–1986, who was making his first flight in space. Mission specialists Ellison Onizuka. 1946–1986, Ronald McNair, 1950–1986, and Judith Resnick, 1949–1986, were all experienced space travelers. And payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, 1944–1986, was making his first space flight. That cold and clear January morning, the Challenger's takeoff was delayed by 2 hours. Freezing temperatures overnight had produced ice on the shuttle and launch pad, which prompted NASA to conduct inspections to assess the condition of the craft. At 11:38 a.m., Challenger was launched into space. Just 73 seconds later and at an altitude of 48,000 feet, the craft still in view of the spectators on the ground, Challenger burst into flames. While NASA controllers were aware of what had happened, they had, among other things, heard Smith utter, "Uh-oh," just 1 second prior to the explosion. It took a moment for the spectators to understand. But as the fireball grew bigger and debris scattered, the spectators, including family and friends of the crew, fell silent. The crew, inside a module that detached from the shuttle during the blow-up, evidently survived the explosion but died upon impact after a 9-mile free fall into the Atlantic Ocean. 6 weeks after the disaster, the crew module was recovered from the ocean floor. All 7 astronauts were buried with full honors. Investigations into the crash revealed that the O-rings, seals, on the shuttle's solid rocket boosters had failed to work, due to the low temperatures. The O-rings had stiffened and thereby lost their ability to act as a seal. A government commission recommended a complete redesign of the solid rocket booster joints. A review of the astronaut escape systems, to work toward achieving greater safety margins. Regulation of the rate of shuttle flights to maximize safety. And a sweeping reform of the shuttle program's management structure. The space agency retrenched. It was almost 3 years later, on September 29, 1988, before another American shuttle flew in space.
What happened to the hippies?
The conflict in Vietnam ended, flower children grew older. Drugs took their toll on some, and by 1980 there was no such thing as free love. Still, a few continued to lead an alternative lifestyle. while at the opposite end of the spectrum others bought back into the establishment. Still others adapted their flower child beliefs to the ever-changing world around them and got on with their lives. Working at jobs and raising children in the most socially and politically conscious way possible.
What are Nader's Raiders?
They were, and are, investigators working with American lawyer and consumer advocate Ralph Nader, 1934. With the help of his research team, Nader wrote the landmark work Unsafe at Any Speed in 1965. It charged that many automobiles weren't as safe as they should be or as consumers had the right to expect them to be. In part the book was responsible for passage in 1966 of the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act, which set motor vehicle safety standards. Nader has continued his watchdog work, founding the Public Citizen Organization, which researches consumer products, promotes consumer awareness, and works to influence legislators to improve consumer safety. While Nader may be the most recognizable face of consumer advocacy, the movement's roots predate his activism. As the consumer age dawned at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, when mass production techniques came into wide use, some observers decried industry standards, or lack thereof, that put the public who used their products at risk. The muckraking journalists of the early 20th century disclosed harmful or careless practices of early industry, raising awareness and bringing about needed reforms. Upton Sinclair, 1878 to 1968, for example, penned the highly influential novel The Jungle, 1906, revealing scandalous conditions of meatpacking plants. The public was outraged upon reading Sinclair's work. President Theodore Roosevelt, 1858 to 1919, ordered an investigation, finding the novelist's descriptions to be true to life. Government moved quickly to pass the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act that same year, 1906. Industry watchdogs continued their work in the early decades of the century. In 1929 Consumers Research Inc. was founded, and in 1936, the Consumers Union was formed. Both of these independent organizations test and rate consumer products. Consumers Union publishes its reports in the monthly magazine Consumer Reports. Such consumer advocacy has served to heighten public awareness, compelling industry to make changes and improving the safety of products in general. Abuses still occur, but at roughly 100 years into the consumer age. The work of consumer watchdogs like Nader's Raiders has made the consumer experience far less risky than it once was.
Who were the Molly Maguires?
They were Irish-American coal miners in eastern Pennsylvania who organized a secret society in 1854. The Molly Maguires aimed to wage a campaign of violence against mine owners and operators. The name of the group came from a society in Ireland that used physical force to fight ruthless landlords. The American miners became determined to defeat their oppressors at all costs. Their numbers grew, and in the decade following the Civil War, 1861 to 65. The Molly Maguires were active both as agitators, and it would later be revealed, as assassins. In 1875 the group incited a coal miners' strike, which was broken by the detective work of Irish-American James McParlin, 1844 to 1919. A Pinkerton guard hired by Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company to infiltrate the Molly Maguires. McParlin revealed the identities of gunmen responsible for the deaths of 9 mine company foremen. Several members of the secret society were arrested, tried and convicted, in 1876, and hanged, in 1877, for the crimes. American sympathies for the plight of the miners were diminished by the headlines proclaiming the terrorist activities of the Molly Maguires. The society dissolved by 1877. Their presence, however, was long felt in the anthracite coal fields of Pennsylvania, where company police monitored activities in the mines and effectively intimidated many miners from organizing.
Who was Clara Barton?
The American humanitarian was called the Angel of the Battlefield for her work during the Civil War, 1861 to 65. Clara, Clarissa Harlow, Barton. 1821 to 1912, was a nurse in army camps and on battlefields, where she cared for the wounded. When the fighting ended, Barton formed a bureau to search for missing men. This demanding work left her exhausted. Recuperating in Switzerland in 1869, Barton learned of the newly formed International Red Cross, established 1863. She rallied to the aid of that volunteer organization, tending the needs of those wounded in the fighting of the Franco-Prussian War, 1870–71, which German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, 1815–1898, had provoked in his attempt to create a unified German Empire. In 1877 Barton began working to form the American Red Cross. Her efforts came to fruition in 1881 with the establishment of the first U.S. branch of the International Red Cross. She became the organization's first president, a post she held from 1882 to 1904. When Johnstown, Pennsylvania, experienced a devastating flood in 1889, Barton took charge of relief work there. She subsequently advocated a clause be added to the Red Cross Constitution, stating that the organization would also provide relief during calamities other than war. She was successful. It is because of Barton that the Red Cross has become a familiar and welcome sight in times of disaster.
Who invented the vaccine?
English physician Edward Jenner, 1749 to 1823, is credited with inventing the vaccine, however. Evidence suggests that vaccination, inoculation of a substance into the body for the purpose of producing active immunity against a disease, was used in China, India, and Persia, present-day Iran, in ancient times. In modern times, Jenner pioneered the science of immunology by developing a vaccination against smallpox. The English physician was practicing medicine in rural Gloucestershire in 1796 when he observed that dairymaids who had been sick with cowpox did not contract smallpox, suggesting that they had developed an immunity to the often fatal disease, which then occurred in epidemics. Jenner must have been quite certain of his theory. He chose to test it on an 8-year-old schoolboy, James Phipps, whom Jenner vaccinated with matter from cowpox vesicles from the hands of a milkmaid, Sarah Nelmes. Jenner then allowed the boy's system to develop the immunity he had previously observed in the dairymaids. Several weeks later, Jenner inoculated Phipps with smallpox, and the boy did not become even the least bit ill. The experiment was a success. Jenner continued his experiments for 2 years and then published his findings, officially announcing his discovery of vaccination in 1798. As Jenner suspected, vaccines provide immunity by causing the body to manufacture substances called antibodies, which fight a disease. Over the course of the 20th century, vaccination programs have greatly reduced disease, particularly in developed nations where childhood immunization programs are very effective. By 1977, vaccination had virtually wiped out smallpox.
What were Pasteur's discoveries on disease?
Louis Pasteur, 1822 to 1895, may be best known for developing the process that bears his name, pasteurization, but the French chemist and microbiologist made other important contributions to public health, including the discovery of vaccines to prevent diseases in animals and the establishment of a Paris Institute for the study of deadly and contagious diseases. In the 1860s, the hard-working Pasteur was asked to investigate problems that French winemakers were having with the fermentation process. Spoilage of wine and beer during fermentation was resulting in serious economic losses for France. Observing wine under a microscope, Pasteur noticed that spoiled wine had a proliferation of bacterial cells that produce lactic acid. The chemist suggested gently heating the wine to destroy the harmful bacteria, and then allowing the wine to age naturally. Pasteur published his findings and his recommendations in book form in 1866. The idea of heating edible substances to destroy disease-causing organisms was later applied to other perishable fluids, chief among them milk. Pasteur later studied animal diseases, developing a vaccination to prevent anthrax in sheep and cattle. The deadly animal disease is spread from animals to humans through contact or the inhalation of spores. In 1876, German physician Robert Koch, 1843 to 1910, had identified the bacteria that causes anthrax. And Pasteur weakened this microbe in his laboratory before injecting it into animals, which then developed an immunity to the disease. He also showed that vaccination could be used to prevent chicken cholera. In 1881, Pasteur began studying rabies, an agonizing and deadly disease spread by the bite of infected animals. Along with his assistant, Pierre-Paul-Émile Roux, 1853 to 1933. Pasteur spent long hours in the laboratory, and the determination paid off. Pasteur developed a vaccine that prevented the development of rabies in test animals. On July 6, 1885, the scientists were called on to administer the vaccine to a small boy who was bitten by a rabid dog. Pasteur hesitated to provide the treatment, but as the boy faced certain and painful death from rabies, Pasteur proceeded. Following several weeks of painful injections to the stomach, the boy did not get rabies. Pasteur's treatment was a success. The curative and preventive treatments for rabies, also called hydrophobia, we know today are based on Pasteur's vaccination, which has allowed officials to control the spread of the disease. In 1888, the Institut Pasteur was established in Paris to provide a teaching and research center on contagious diseases. Pasteur was director of the institute until his death in 1895.